Welcome to Part 2 of Security and Risk Management, Lesson 1.11, Understanding and Applying Threat Modeling. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security and Risk Management domain, and we are in the key area of knowledge, letter J, which is Understand and Apply Threat Modeling. Our topics will include threat modeling, threat intelligence, the Common Vulnerability Database, the National Vulnerability Database, information sharing and analysis centers, and actionable intelligence. So let's start with defining what a threat is. A threat is a category of objects, persons, or process or an event that represents a potential danger to an asset. Let's repeat that. A threat is a category of objects, persons, process, or event that represents a potential danger to an asset. A threat agent or adversary is a specific instance of a threat. So we may decide that weather is a threat, but a particular hurricane, maybe Hurricane Bertha, is our threat agent or adversary. It's a specific instance of a threat. We're really concerned about threats specifically because they represent a potential danger to our asset. And in this case, it's going to be information or an information system asset, or it could be the people or the facilities. All those things that we talked about initially in our definition of information security. Threat modeling is the approach we take to identifying and categorizing potential threats. So threat modeling, again, is the approach to identifying and categorizing our potential threats, and there are a number of different ways to do it. One could be an extremely ad hoc way, which is we just sort of learn about threats and we incorporate those into our decision making. But that's not a very useful way, and certainly it's very inconsistent. So there are three approaches that you may consider, and many organizations actually institute all three. An attacker-centric model starts with identifying the attacker and evaluates the attacker's goals and potential techniques. So say, for example, you're a financial institution and you know that criminals want to get into your system or want to get into your customer systems, and they want to initiate fraudulent ACH or wire transfers. So by thinking about the attacker and what their goals are, you then back into what are the potential techniques, and that's going to bring you around to what the threat is. What's the potential danger? The second is an architecture-centric model, and that focuses on system design and potential attacks against each component. So you map out the entire flow of the system design or the information system or the project, whichever you're doing. And each stage in the design or the project, you look at what could be a potential attack against that component. So that would be an architecture-centric model. And our third model is an asset-centric model. We begin by identifying the asset value, what it is we're trying to protect, and what the value of that asset is, and what might be the motivation of any threat agents. So we can threat model by looking at attackers, we can look at architecture, or we can look at assets. And in many cases, we're going to have a hybrid threat model by considering all of these. Now, one of the ways that we learn about threats is threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is evidence-based knowledge which gives us some context, so understanding how the threat is happening, to who is it happening, what's the implication. Also, the indicators of compromise, and IOC indicators of compromise is evidence that we can look at to see if a compromise is actually happening or an incident is actually happening, and the implications of the threat that can be used to inform decision making. You can get threat intelligence from both private sector, government, and collaborative initiatives. And the delivery mechanisms for threat intelligence might be email, it might be a feed, it might be social media and portals. You do need to make a distinction, though, between raw threat information and threat intelligence. Threat intelligence truly is evidence-based knowledge, where threat information often is just a raw feed. It might be that this IP address is problematic, or we've heard about this particular threat, but no indication of how it actually works. And while that may be somewhat interesting to get threat information, in the end, it's not really very useful. So if you're subscribing to an organization that provides threat intelligence, you do want to take the time to really look at their samples and understand, are they giving me threat intelligence or are they just giving me raw data feeds? So threats are these potential dangers. But in order for a threat to operate, there has to be a corresponding vulnerability. A vulnerability is the weakness in a system that can be exploited by a threat. Now, it could be in a system, it could be in a facility, it could be in people. But in order for a threat to actually have any impact, there must be that corresponding weakness that can be exploited. So an exploit is when a threat agent or a threat adversary successfully takes advantage of a vulnerability. They find your weakness, they take advantage of that weakness, and that's known as an exploit. So how do you know about your vulnerabilities? Well, you may do a vulnerability assessment to find out what your vulnerabilities are. There are public sources available to you of vulnerabilities, and first and foremost is the Common Vulnerability and Exposures, known as the CVE database, which is a dictionary of publicly known security vulnerabilities. Each CVE identifier includes a CVE identifier number, and you'll often see that if you're doing a vulnerability scan and you're using a vulnerability application, it will often come back and say to you, it found a vulnerability, and it will give you the CVE identifier number. You'll also get a brief description of the security vulnerability or the exposure, and then there'll be any pertinent references, including vulnerability reports or advisories. So if you are given information that has a CVE number, you can always go back to this database and look it up, or you can be searching this database on a regular basis to understand what are new vulnerabilities. And very often when vendors will provide information about their vulnerabilities, they will include the CVE number or the CVE identifier. All of this information is available to everyone in the National Vulnerability Database. The National Vulnerability Database, the NVD, is a product of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Computer Security Division, and it's sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security's National Cybersecurity Division. We're going to take a look at the NVD database in just a sec, but you'll see when we get there, the NVD has all of the CVE vulnerabilities, so it contains that database, and then it contains some ancillary information. It has security configuration checklists, it has alerts from US CERT, and it has vulnerability notices from US CERT. So let's take a look. So here we are at the National Vulnerability Database. You can see that it's sponsored by NIST and by the Department of Homeland Security and US CERT. You can see you've got the database. If you look through this page, particularly on the left-hand side, if you go down through resource status, you can see that the MVD contains the CVE vulnerabilities, checklists, your US CERT alerts, your US CERT vulnerability notes, and additional information. This is a great resource to have. You want to know that it exists and that you should be using it on a regular basis. Another source of information are the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, and they're known as ISACs. So an Information Sharing and Analysis Center is a trusted sector-specific entity which provides sector-specific information sharing about vulnerabilities, threats, and incidents. So if you're in the financial sector or you're in the public utility sector, there's a whole list of sectors. Actually, all of the critical infrastructure sectors have ISACs. So it's a way that organizations within that sector can share information and know that that information is only going to other members who have been vetted, as well as affiliates who have been vetted as well. The Information Sharing and Analysis Center, ISAC, were a concept that was introduced in a Presidential Decision Directive. Actually, it was PDD 63. And PDD 63 recognized the potential for the critical infrastructure of the United States to be attacked either through physical or cyber means with the intent to affect military or economic power of the country. So it was set up to ensure that critical infrastructure sectors had a way to share information with each other. So it's a great source of information if you are in one of those sectors. So the goal of threat modeling, the goal of understanding your vulnerabilities, the goal of information sharing is actionable intelligence. Actionable intelligence is information that can be used to either reduce the likelihood of an exploit or reduce its impact. Remember, an exploit is when a threat agent is able to take advantage of a vulnerability. So actionable intelligence is what we use either to reduce the vulnerability, so reduce the likelihood of the exploit, or if there is an exploit, to be prepared for it and to reduce its impact. So that's our actionable intelligence. So let's do a lesson review. We talked about threats and vulnerabilities and exploits. We talked about different methods to do threat modeling, attacker-centric, an architecture-centric, and an asset-centric threat model. We introduced you to the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures CVE database, which many of you may already be using. We looked at the National Vulnerability Database. We discussed Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, the ISACs, and we defined actionable intelligence. You want to make sure that you're really comfortable with all of those concepts. We're going to be building on each of these concepts in our subsequent lessons. Let's move into a match the meaning. So lesson 1.11, match the meaning, threat, threat agent, a threat model, an IOC, a vulnerability, a CVE, the NVD, and an exploit. Those are the terms that I want you to match up with the mixed up meanings that are in the right-hand column. So spend a few minutes doing that, put me on pause, come on back when you're ready, and we'll go through each one of those. Okay, let's look at lesson 1.11 terms. The first was a threat. Threat is a potential danger. The second was our threat agent, which is a specific instance of a threat. A threat agent also might be called a threat adversary or a threat source. Our threat model was our approach to identifying threats. We looked at 3 different ways to do that. That was our attacker-centric, our architecture-centric, and our asset-centric. An IOC is an indicator of compromise. So it's evidence that we can be looking for to tell us that a compromise has occurred or is about to occur. A vulnerability is a weakness. That could be a weakness in hardware or in software, weakness in a process, weakness in people, weakness in a facility. But a vulnerability is a weakness. CVE referred to the common vulnerabilities and exposure database, that CVE entries each have identifiers and are specific to a publicly known vulnerability. The NVD was our National Vulnerability Database that is sponsored by NIST and the Department of Homeland Security. And an exploit is when a threat takes advantage of a vulnerability. It's a threat, threat agent, threat model, IOC, vulnerability, CVE, NVD, and exploit are all terms that you need to be very familiar and comfortable with. So we're going to wrap up this lesson with our CISSP exam tips. Threat intelligence is evidence-based knowledge. We want to contrast that with threat information, which is just usually raw data feeds. That threat intelligence is evidence-based knowledge. That an ISAC is a trusted sector-specific entity. It's how within a sector, specifically in our critical infrastructure sectors, information can be shared freely. And lastly, an exploit is when a threat agent successfully takes advantage of a vulnerability. Thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next.